forward to chatting with you for the next little while. Just to mention before I get started that much of the work I'll talk about here was supported by the BioAg grant program here at Washington State University, and I'm housed at WSU School of the Environment in Pullman. So today I'll be talking a bit about riparian conservation. I'm sure many of you know more about riparian conservation than I do. So please do not take anything that I say as an answer. What I try to do is provide new ways of looking at things, maybe by putting together knowledge of different types. I work a lot with existing knowledge and existing data, trying to put things together in a place-based way so that we can have conversations. So I hope to hear from all of you. Please think about whatever ideas pop into your head as I go through some of these ideas and examples. And I would love to hear from any of you, just whatever pops into your head. Okay, now if I can get my pointer to work, we'll be in a great place. All right. So as many of you probably know, riparian areas in Eastern Washington look really different depending where you go. So we have our forested areas, we have our drylands with natural riparian trees, a few of those around. There are many areas that are drylands that never had trees, or places that now the stream has been incised, it's cut down so much that probably we have kind of a new system and would not support the kind of trees that we see in the upper right picture. And all of that is just what we see as we drive around the Palouse. And from my perspective as an ecologist, I say, well, each of these is a unique setting and different vegetation would survive and thrive in different settings. And the benefits to either people or nature, depending how you look at it, are going to be different depending on what is happening in that place, what's happening with the water, what's happening with erosion, what's happening with the plants, and what will survive if we plant it. So when I talk about the benefits of riverside areas, I try to think about riverside meaning places that could have riparian vegetation, riparian habitat being described as unique communities of plants that can survive and thrive in the environment next to a stream, usually includes disturbance like flooding, changes in water level, that type of thing. And so we can think about some of the outcomes, some of the reasons that people implement riparian conservation. And these range from cleaner water to conserving biodiversity. Many of them are salmon motivated in our part of the world. And each one of these outcomes that I talk about has a specific contribution from riparian vegetation. I'll call it the riparian contribution. Many of you are probably familiar with these. What I try to think about is, where do these need to happen? Where do these changes or maintaining riparian vegetation need to happen in order for this contribution to really lead to this outcome? So many of the things that we focus on, such as reducing sediment and pollutants from runoff that are going into the stream with filtration by riparian grasses, for example, they can provide benefits on site in the place where the restoration is happening. And oftentimes there's a potential for broader scale benefits if those practices were implemented over larger scales. Sometimes the benefit really can only happen if those actions happen at larger scales, or at least are coordinated along a stream. Or sometimes the benefit could just be increased by having more participants in a certain area or along a stream. So I try to break down these different outcomes. And again, this is not an answer, but just rather a type of brainstorm to say, okay, if we want to reduce soil erosion and stabilize our banks with riparian vegetation, that's pretty certainly going to have some on-site benefits. It reliably does. In a broader scale, potentially, if this was happening along whole river systems, we might see larger scale improvements because of that. But the benefits of these types of practices tend to be more on-site. When we talk about cooling water, for example, to preserve salmon during warming climates, riparian vegetation can shade the water in the channel. It can provide more moderate water temperatures and improve salmon survival. And that is something that is really hard to achieve with just one site, one riparian restoration, but much more likely to be achieved the more time the water spends in those shady places as it flows downstream. So this type of difference in scale of practices from site to coordination at larger scales is something that I really try to focus on and try to think about how can we think of each place as having a role in the larger outcomes that a lot of the riparian incentives are aiming for. And by incentives, I'll let you know what I mean more specifically as we go further on. So just something else to focus on. I won't go through all of this in detail, but the idea of biodiversity conservation. I know a lot of folks are interested in wildlife or interested in salmon and riparian areas. Even if the changes we do there or the things we maintain there are intended for other purposes, they often provide habitat, and sometimes they provide stepping stones of habitat to allow wildlife or fish to move in response to change. So that's where I point to the on-site benefit of having riparian vegetation, especially if we have different types of riparian vegetation. There can be lots of benefits to lots of different species. And then potentially if those, if the locations of riparian natural riparian vegetation are located in the right places, there are potential benefits to help different creatures respond to climate change, for example, or different changes in land use and survive. And so again, from a perspective as an ecologist, because that's how I'm originally trained, a lot of these benefits that we talk about, they're linked to how the water flows, how energy and materials flow in different directions. And these are always changing through time. As anyone who has spent time looking at a river knows this. And so we can talk about the connectivity or the relationships along a stream, all the way from the headwaters down to the sea. But also really rivers include their floodplains. And so there's this sideways dimension to how all of this is happening. And then also below the surface. So there's always exchange between the surface and the shallow groundwater just beneath the surface. And so the question I ask is, how can we, by keeping all of this in mind, how can we think about increasing the likelihood of positive outcomes, both at the site scale and this broader scale, whatever it happens to be, from individual riparian practices? And following from that, is there potential to maybe find new funding sources that maybe you didn't originally think of, because there might be other benefits to what it is you're already doing or what your riparian area already offers? So the question that comes to my mind, because I'm looking for something that I can map, being a mapper, is where do policies that influence riparian conservation apply? I know people's reasons for doing riparian conservation may not be because of policies, but sometimes policies do influence those decisions. Sometimes they influence the funding or technical assistance that's available to support those. And so this is something that I can map. And so something that I have worked on and continue to work on is mapping the different policies or funding mechanisms that apply to places next to streams, whether they're already riparian buffers or not, to potentially highlight some opportunities to focus on some of the broader benefits of interest in addition to those site scale benefits. And thinking about specifically how certain places might be more conducive to conservation practices that aim towards certain types of benefits. I'll get more specific so you know what I mean in a few moments here. And also looking at places where potentially outreach and just communication might help to increase the likelihood of achieving these on-site and broader benefits. And this is particularly in places where the condition of riparian areas is pretty good. Maybe there's diverse vegetation, or it's just really healthy and established. It's been there for a while. Those are places where maybe there's not a lot of formal protection or formal recognition of the importance of it for wildlife, for example. But then having conversations where people become more aware of that might actually help to encourage more people to participate or just maintain what's already there. So I'd like to transparently state my disclaimer. I'm about to present some maps. These maps are not intended to be any kind of final product or prescription for action. It's just a way of showing some things that happen, some things that exist, some Earth observation data that help us to look at the landscape and hopefully have a conversation about the role of each place and how the land is managed in each place that might have larger implications. So one way that I go about doing this, or that I have gone about doing this, is something I call eco-policy mapping. And so this means putting together something we know about the ecology, what type of ecosystem it is, and then also what type of policies tend to drive decision-making in those places. And so in a recent study, I divided the state of Washington into 3 basic areas. And then I thought about watersheds within each area, because watersheds are a natural unit, but in Washington, we also do try to manage the conservation districts. I know work at watershed level a lot of the time, and the voluntary stewardship program as well. So the black lines on this map of Washington are all the WRIA or WIRA boundaries, for those who are familiar with those. They're watershed management boundaries. And then these ecological regions essentially are the forested, primarily forested areas on the west side in a natural state, the east side forested areas, and then the east side drylands, which are referred to sometimes as the Columbia Plateau ecoregion. And focus then inside the Columbia Plateau ecoregion, and identified here 5 different types of conservation measures that they fall under these specific laws: the Growth Management Act, Clean Water Act, State Forest Practices, Endangered Species, and watershed planning. Each one of these is aiming for some type of outcome related to riparian areas, and try to summarize that here in this table. So for example, the voluntary stewardship program talks a lot about riparian ecosystem functions. Best management practices aim for clean water. In the forested areas, riparian practices aim for clean water, and also a lot of interest in salmon conservation. Salmon recovery, of course, is focused on biodiversity and salmon conservation. And then sometimes we're thinking about how much water is available too, not just the water quality. And so then we could start mapping out, because policies apply to certain places, we can map out which combinations of functions are identified by policies that map in certain places. Again, not to say that this is any kind of prescription, but maybe just an indication that there's broader interest in these places in specific combinations of these riparian benefits. So I'm going to focus on these going forward. And zooming into our east side watersheds here, I asked a really simple question: how many, and actually which, but we're not going to get into that level of detail here, just which policies and how many of them apply to each watershed. So we have some drylands where 2 policies seem to really dominate, and some drylands where 3 dominate. And then within each one of these other regions, different combinations of policies. So there are really different reasons for the reasons that are aimed for in the policies that apply in different places just across Washington state. On the west side, a lot of these policies are based on the relationship between trees next to the stream and salmon. And that has a long history that I'm not going to get into here. But things on the east side are more diverse and more complicated. And so some of the work I've done has been looking into what are the ways that we can make the most of our riparian areas on the east side, getting beyond just a straightforward relationship between trees and salmon, because there are other things that are beneficial besides just the presence of trees and salmon habitat in our area. So a different question that we can ask, that was sort of one example of what we can do. Another one that is also a type of eco-policy mapping, if you will, is looking at a finer scale. Instead of looking at watershed scales, it's looking at each parcel of land, and not saying that anyone is trying to regulate or prescribe what should happen in a parcel, but just asking the question, who makes decisions about this parcel and what might influence those decisions? This is an example of a study that I did and focused on Okanagan County as an example. Many of you are probably familiar with Okanagan County, but it has forests and agricultural areas in it. And there's also a lot of interest in our state of helping to conserve wildlife, and also water quality by maintaining the streams and potentially increasing habitat for wildlife across the Okanagan Valley, from the Rocky Mountains over here in the east over to the edge of the Cascades on the west. And so I took a look at the potential riparian corridors throughout this whole area just to see, is there a chance that we could leverage riparian actions to also help wildlife in this area? Are they in the right places? What might that look like without any new without anything new from the law side, but just from people making decisions. And so all of these light blue areas here are areas next to streams that could potentially be have riparian vegetation in a more natural sense, not saying that they already do. And there are some land ownership information on this map as well, but what I'd like you to really focus on is just the area is spanned by these riparian corridors in lots of different ways, potentially. And so while ecologists and biologists often make models of the landscape that focus on just where would be the best place for wildlife, in this case, we're saying, let's look at what people are already tending to do, particularly on working lands in riparian areas, and as a way that we could just make those same actions contribute to the broader benefit of helping wildlife. And so in this case, that type of mapping allowed me to model some potential wildlife corridors, thinking about that, and also to pull out some information to highlight places where maybe riparian restoration would be really beneficial to wildlife in addition to all the other benefits we know riparian areas have. So those areas are mapped here in yellow. Again, this is just one possible scenario. These are models. So depending on what you feed into them, you'll get something different out. So this just happens to be the outcome from what I happen to feed into this model. But there's all different kinds of information that we could feed into them. Once we have fed that in, then we can ask questions like, where are places where the condition is pretty good? And actually, if we just ask people how they feel about wildlife or try to get them more connected with the community of people that are maintaining riparian areas, might that be something that would help contribute? And those are the places that are highlighted in light blue here. So after I talked with some folks at Palouse Conservation District about this work, they asked me, well, if we were going to put wildlife corridors on the Palouse, where would they be? So I just did a little bit of initial exploration into the Palouse area. And once again, this is just one model. That's one example of something that we could feed in. But I looked at some of that same type of information. So where are the areas that are still pretty natural on the Palouse? Where are the areas where there are incentives for riparian restoration? And started to look at some models of how we might enhance movement for wildlife between Kamiak Butte and Rose Creek, just as one example. And so the way these models work, this is a wildlife corridor model type thing. And so the blue areas are the ones that would, in theory, be easier for wildlife to move through, and the red ones harder. Keep in mind that just the way that I did this map, it's naturally going to have red areas on the outside. It's kind of always like a bullseye pattern. So the red on the outside here doesn't actually mean anything. But the relative blues in here and yellows might indicate some areas are maybe a little more conducive to wildlife movement than others. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause here. Much of my research also focuses on how we can use existing imagery or low-cost drone-based imagery to monitor the outcomes of some of these actions. And so before I switch gears and jump into that, I just wanted to pause and see if anyone has any questions or thoughts about what I have covered so far. You could feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. That's okay with me. And if not, that's okay. We'll just continue on. So I thought I would give some examples of both the watershed scale type of monitoring we can do, and then also the site scale monitoring. And this is so important to see how things are and the changes we make. Are they being effective? Are they effective at the scales they need to be? And how can we meet reporting requirements, for example, of the voluntary stewardship program that requires us to report the cumulative effect of lots of individual actions at the watershed scale. So I have been working with Brad Johnson at Palouse Conservation District, helping out with some of the VSP reporting for Whitman and Garfield counties. Folks who are not familiar, the Voluntary Stewardship Program enables agricultural counties in Washington to opt in. And this means that voluntary conservation measures can be reported, and thus there is an option to avoid direct regulatory oversight under the Growth Management Act for critical areas. And so I worked with Brad and other collaborators to try to come up with a way that we could help to develop metrics that would work for these counties in their reporting that's required under the Voluntary Stewardship Program. And this means we have to show whether there's change happening. Here specifically, I'm going to talk about riparian change happening at the watershed scale, but not identifying any individual actions or parcels or anything like that, maintaining privacy. And something that's really extra important here in our drylands, of course, is to distinguish natural variability in how hot and dry one summer is to the next, for example. So there's change from that's natural, that's different than change due to management actions, whether it's restoration or just crop rotations. And so we need ways that we can say, hey, this was natural change versus this is human change. And then also try to find a way that our conservation district staff have fewer places they need to visit. You know, if we can say these lots of areas seem like they're not really changing and focus on the areas that seem like they are changing to go in the ground and verify, then that could be helpful as well, potentially. So this is what we were trying to do. And then the plan here is to transfer the capability to do this to conservation districts and others who are helping with the reporting for this program and similar programs. And so I've already started doing that. We have folks at different conservation districts and the Conservation Commission who are using this. So I'm going to focus on Whitman and Garfield counties over here in southeastern Washington, and talk specifically about Sentinel satellite imagery, which some people may be familiar with. It's freely available from the European Space Agency, and it takes pictures every 5 days or so of our part of the world with pixels that are about 10 by 10 meters in size, so 30 by 30 feet. And they're just fine enough to pick up our riparian areas at the watershed scale. And so I've been using Google Earth Engine, which is freely available with freely available data, to come up with metrics for VSP reporting on riparian areas. This is an example of what it looks like. And this is now a freely available app. So if anyone wants to check it out, you're welcome to. I'll give you the links, and I can also drop them in the chat at the end. So you can go in and turn on and off layers and zoom in and out and check this thing out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that now. We could save that for Q&A if folks want to see it. But essentially, we can look at different years of imagery at the same time. So I focused on the end of the growing season. This is mid-August through September, when our riparian areas really pop out because they're bright green, right? Most other things are brown at that time. And this one in particular is looking at 2016 to 2019. And so we can look for every one of those 10-meter squares and say, was it green at the end of this year? Was it green at the end of next year? Was it green at the end of the year after that? And start to see some patterns of areas that are always green and areas that are always brown that time of year, and then areas of change. And then when we find areas of change, we can start to track, because now I didn't orient you to where this map is, if you can't see where all these things are. This is the lower Snake River Basin. So we have Spokane all the way up here at the top, and down here we're in the Blue Mountains, Pomeroy and such. Here we're over in Idaho. And the reason that I mapped this area was to include the forested areas. And so that's how we can monitor what natural vegetation is doing. And that's how we can account for natural variability. So if we see that the forests at the edges are showing patterns of maybe drought stress certain years, and then we're also seeing that in other parts of the counties, then we can say that's probably due to natural variability, as opposed to when we see changes in crop rotations or something like that. Those will pop up as the whole field will change. And so we can start to recognize, based on the shapes and the characteristics, probably what kind of change it is. And then those are the areas that we would want to visit on the ground to confirm that there's any change. But essentially, these areas that stay green these are the areas that are always green all the way through the growing season. And so that layer has been really useful for other things so far, including looking at the intersect between habitat area and agricultural area, which is one of the things that we need to report for the voluntary stewardship program. Another application of that is I was able to add that information to this very preliminary sketch map of where we might help wildlife travel across the Palouse. And we can overlay other data on these types of models. So here we have the blue area was kind of the easiest for wildlife to cross potentially between Kamiak Butte and Rose Creek. And that's a combination of how far the path is and what they would have to travel through. Then these kind of white outlined areas, those are all the places that are close to streams. And then these green areas are either areas that have been mapped as potential prairie remnants, or these faded out green areas. Those are the ones that I got from the Sentinel data that are places that tend to be always green. So potentially by putting all this information together, it's information of place, location near a stream, location near a place like Kamiak Butte, what the vegetation is doing, and then we can update this layer of what the vegetation is doing over time. The satellite data becomes available within about a month, so we have through 2022 right now. And so it's a neat way that we can try to look at places and ask questions about, you know, what role might this place play, or what places might be really important that maybe people don't realize how important they could be. So this is an example of taking that idea of eco-policy mapping and combining it with some of this Earth observation data that we can get from satellites. And all of this is a really low-cost source of information. This is another sketch map that I made, just one way to look at Whitman County using a scheme kind of like in that Okanagan County study, except this place focusing specifically on those areas that I had talked about with Palouse Conservation District. So we could use this kind of information to say which areas maybe really, you know, riparian restoration could be extra beneficial for wildlife, or outreach and networking could be really helpful. So this is the kind of thing, or conserve and connect. These green areas are areas that are in really good shape and are really important to take care of from this perspective. So again, this is just an idea, but an example of how we can use this kind of information. Okay. And the topic that often has the most questions I have saved for last here, and that is what can we do with drones to look at specific sites for riparian monitoring. So I'm going to focus here on the finest scale of what I see to be available at low cost, and that's drone-based imagery, and we could get down to centimeter resolution. The other thing about drones is typically, as long as it's not too windy or stormy, we can fly at the right time for whatever it is that you want to capture. So if there's a certain plant that's flowering at a certain time, if there's an invasive species you're concerned about that you want to capture, or if there's a certain time that you could see some types of plants and not others, if you want to see how the banks of the stream are eroding and you want to fly after all the vegetation's dropped its leaves, you can fly whenever, as long as the weather cooperates. And that makes drones a really powerful tool for telling the story of what's happening in one riparian area. So I conducted a study where I went to 9 different places around Whitman County with different types of riparian areas and flew a couple different types of drone setups. And from these, we were able to create 3-dimensional models of the plant surface. So it's basically whatever's on top. If it's bare soil, you'll see that. If it's water, you'll see that. If it's plants, you'll see whatever plant is on the top. So we make these 3-dimensional models of the surface by taking lots of photos. I'll show you a little bit more how that works. Then we can use other types of sensors to monitor plant health and see how vigorously the plants are living and growing. And we can also detect change over time. So all of these images that I collected are geo-referenced. This particular set I collected in 2019. So for example, we could go back after 5 years have passed and collect a new set of images and lay them over. We could see how much the plants have grown, measure changes in height, measure changes in vigor, or how wide the riparian area is, and that sort of thing. So here's an example of how we go about making these three-dimensional models. This setup was a really old drone. It was a really old and cheap drone setup that I was able to work with as a student a few years ago. It was a 3DR Solo with a GoPro. The whole thing was probably worth a few $100s at the time, maybe. And I used pool noodles. You can kind of see them in the background in this picture. I would make an X with different pool noodles, and we would go read the locations of those with a GPS. So that would give us really good location referencing on all the images that we would get. And then fly a mission autonomously. So you program in advance and then you press go, and the drone goes and it flies a pattern to capture, with lots of different overlap, lots of different directions, tons of photos of all the things in the area you want to focus on. And so this enables our software that we use, which are the one we use is called Agisoft Metashape, to just use regular true color images, we call them, with red, green, and blue in them. Regular photos from a GoPro. It'll find all the overlapping items in all of the images and recreate a three-dimensional model from that. And so that's what you see here on the right. And so this is in a canyon, and you can see the creek bottom and all of the riparian plants down here. And you can actually, in the software, you can turn it sideways and examine it, so you can see the structure of the trees and where there's trees and shrubs and that sort of thing. Again, only the outermost surface. But it's a really neat tool for capturing an area in not just for visualizing, but also for mapping. So we can map vegetation types onto this. We can use height as one of the things to define what's a tree, what's a shrub, that type of thing. And we can also track change over time, because I referenced all of my pool noodle locations with a special set of satellites, so we could go back at any time and refly it and see how there's change. So in this example, it's a little bit coarser. The resolution was maybe 3 to 5 centimeters, but with newer sensors that we're using, we could get down to 1 centimeter or even finer. So super resolved, and you really get a nice real life picture stitched together from all these different pictures that we take. And then the other type of images that I collected, this is with a bit fancier drone. It's a commercial grade drone, just like the one that Palouse Conservation District has, actually. And in this case, also, I planned autonomous missions, so the drone would fly a grid. But here we're just collecting a single set of images that are overlapping enough that we can stitch them together. And we're collecting information beyond just the regular true color of a photo. Here we're getting what's called the red edge and near infrared parts of the spectrum. And these are really important because they relate to photosynthesis. So a plant that's really active and healthy is going to give a stronger signal that we can read with these bands that you couldn't read with just true color. And one way to show these is in this image that I have here. This is from the WC property near Smoot Hill. There's a riparian area along 4 Mile Creek, and there's some willow trees and some dogwood shrubs and then some canary grass. And so here we can use images like this false color image, and the redder the tree is, the more vigorously it was growing. And I'm pretty sure this one was from September, so the trees were just kind of starting to slow down towards the end of the summer, and you could see them fading out to kind of a purpley color. So anyway, we can do calculations on these, or we can use them visually to compare, and it's a really powerful way to capture even larger areas than we can get with the other type. The mission for these represent took less than 10 minutes to fly. So we could cover a much larger area with this if that was something of interest. And we'll continue to experiment out at this property. It's a really great place to fly. It's also more than 5 miles from the airport, so easier to get permission to fly. So coming back to the Palouse, Eastern Washington, and our variety of riparian areas, Again, each unique setting, and there's so many more, every place is unique, determines what can be supported, what the potential benefits are, and how best to document what is happening or what could happen in that place. And so that's what I continue to investigate. And I hope that this has been helpful for folks. I'm not sure, it's hard on Zoom to tell, but it would be great to hear if anyone has thoughts or questions on any of that. I included references for some of the things I mentioned on slides in case anyone wants to look them up. If anyone wants any of these papers, I'm happy to send them to you. And then we can open up for questions, and I'll just drop those links in the chat in case anyone wants to play with any of those apps.